please give me a warm welcome to Jarrett Walker. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's always exciting to have a chance to come out and meet the people who are on the front lines of making transit better in their own communities. And I am one of those people who kind of flies around the world helping with that in various kinds of communities. And I'm also the author of a book called Human Transit, which unfortunately I do not have piles of here to sell to you, but it is easy to find in all the usual places. And you know, at the beginning of a video, there's always a little commercial. And so the commercial at the beginning of the speech is really just about the book. It's a really helpful tool for people who want to find their way into public transit issues. Think through how this tool works, because it is a tool, and like any tool, it can work well or badly depending on how you use it. One of the things I do particularly is argue that if we think carefully about the geometry of public transit, about what this thing is and how it interacts with the geometry of how communities are laid out, we find it presents us with certain choices we have to think about. It interrogates our values in certain ways. It requires us to make certain trade-offs. And I'll be happy to talk more about that. And then, of course, I talk a lot about consequences for land use and location choice, because every time you decide, anyone in your community decides to build anything anywhere, they are making a decision about public transit. They're making a decision about whether public transit will be more or less viable as a result of their decision to put that thing where they're putting it. And I'll talk a little more about that. I just did a new edition of the book, which features much more pushback about technology hype. So the first edition of the book came out in 2011, and by 23, it was obvious that a book about public transit that came out in 2011 would be presumed to be out of date, because we had been bombarded with so much hype from the technology industry about how everything is about to change and everything's going to be different, and all you people who aren't on board with us are dinosaurs. And so I needed to push back on that, because there's a certain amount of value in that, and there's also just a lot of hype, and it's created a lot of confusion. There's a new chapter on planning for diversity, by which I mean the need to think very broadly about who the potential transit customer is rather than narrowly. There's an expanded discussion of location choices, but the big thing I did was to jack up the whole house and replace the foundation by building the whole thing again on the concept of freedom. And I feel like more than ever, freedom is a key tool for explaining why we support public transit, but it can't be just an empty, happy word like it is so much in our political discourse. We have to be able to talk about what we mean and how we measure it. And let me talk briefly about that. So one of the basic analytic tools that we use in all of our work, and again, we're a firm that goes around helping communities think through their network design choices. We use this tool called the Wall Around Your Life. And it looks like this. Here's a person. She's in a community full of possible destinations, places she could work, places she could study, places she could shop, things she could do, people she could meet. We're really talking about all the opportunities of life that require leaving home. And in a fixed amount of time that she's likely to have in her day, there's an area she could get to on the transit system as it is, and her access to opportunity is simply the number of useful destinations that are in that area. Now, I'll give you an example from a big city study just to show how we use this, but what I want you to notice is the way a quick analysis produces a very powerful piece of rhetoric, a very powerful soundbite. So, when we did the redesign in Dublin, Ireland a few years ago, we did this analysis. So there's a person in a hypothetical location in the city, Dundrum, and she's asking, where could I be in 45 minutes? That's pretty much, where could I work? Where could I study? The existing network, the answer to that question is a blob. The proposed network, the answer to that question is a bigger blob. And we can calculate the differential and show what area she's gained, what area she's lost. One of the cool things we did in Dublin was to put a tool on the web where people could look up their own location or any location they cared about and see how the access where exactly the access had expanded and where it had diminished. And then, of course, there's an area lost, an area gained, and so we can run the numbers. She can get to 25% more jobs. We calculate that citywide, then add it up for every zone in the city, and we get to the winning soundbite. The average Dubliner can get to 16% more destinations in 45 minutes. And I just wanted to say, and now and then I would say, think about the way in which we're saying that the average Dubliner, if they're going to use public transit, is 16% more free. Because what is freedom but the presence of different options before us of things we could do? Meaningfully different options of things we could do. That's why, for example, people who work on food security measure the distance or travel time to the second closest grocery store, because they recognize that if you can only get to one grocery store, you don't actually have any choices. And being free means having choices. So the cool thing about this tool, and the reason we use it so much, is that it actually hits so many things that different people care about, people who think they disagree with each other. The whole point of being in a community is that we have we are in the presence of opportunities that are presented by the presence of other people. We tend to live, most of us live in towns or cities so that we can do things quickly that involve the other people around us, whether that's jobs, studying, society, whatever. This turns out to be a pretty good predictor of the potential for ridership. That is to say, if we improve access to opportunity, we seem to improve ridership, and we're seeing that correlation more and more. But finally, of course, we're simply talking about personal freedom for everyone who, for any reason, does not want to rely on driving or cannot rely on driving. The other cool thing about this tool, notice, is that I can use the same tool to measure both the impact of a transportation decision, like a transit planning decision, but I can also measure the impact of a land use decision, right? So if your community college moves from here to, say, up on the hillside there, that's going to have an impact on this person's access to opportunity, quite apart from whatever the transportation system is doing. We can measure that too. When we're talking about access to opportunity, we're always summing all three parts of a transit trip, so the walk, the wait, and the ride. And the other thing I want to really emphasize is the importance of the wait, because many people who come to this topic as motorists can kind of visualize what the walk is, and they understand traveling in the vehicle, but they often undervalue the wait or don't really quite grasp what the wait means in terms of how it disincentivizes travel. So one of the things you'll sometimes hear is, well, you know, waiting isn't really waiting anymore because we all have our laptops and we can work in a cafe or whatever whenever the bus goes, and deal with whenever the bus goes. And I want to emphasize that, in fact, what we're talking about when we talk about waiting is not standing at the time you spend standing at the bus stop, because of course most of us have apps now. We can find the information. We don't actually have to stand at the bus stop for 2 hours if we know the bus isn't coming for 2 hours. But still, the knowledge that the bus isn't coming for 2 hours is limiting to our freedom in all kinds of ways. And that's what I'm trying to measure by counting waiting that way, by always counting the different, essentially I'm talking about the difference between when you want to go and when you can go. That is the result of the limitations of the schedule. So when I'm talking about waiting, I'm talking about frequency, and frequency is a profoundly neglected value, partly because it's difficult to explain to motorists. Motorists don't have that experience of being stuck until. Well, now and then you may be stuck at a traffic light for a couple of minutes, or behind a freight train for a little while, but the transit experience is much more fundamentally about that disconnect between when you want to go and when you can go, and that sense of being stuck until something happens. So I just want to mention that frequency is a cubed benefit. That is to say, it does three different mathematically independent cool things. It means less waiting, but it also means you make connections more easily, because if you have to change from one bus to another bus, you're not likely to wait as long for the connection. And it also means better reliability. The bus breaks down, the next one will be along soon. Because of that cubed quality, we tend to see a nonlinear payoff to frequency in ridership. And your challenge always when you're doing transit planning is that people are looking at the map, and that what the first thing they see are new places you should go. More routes you should have, more places you should go. But that trades off against being able to concentrate service in one place high enough so that you actually get frequency and get all of those payoffs. So be aware of the tendency, the overwhelming pressure to dissipate to the point that you're not able to offer enough frequency to be relevant to enough people. If you're curious about thinking more about that, please dig into my book where I talk about it in detail. But fundamentally, because frequency pays off in a nonlinear way, if I actually wanted to maximize the ridership of a network, if that's all I were doing, I might just run I-84 and Highway 14 and not much else, right? Because going to all the places where people need us is different from maximizing ridership. That's something that's tricky to think about, but I promise you it's not really avoidable once you dig down. Now, I'm not saying you should want to maximize ridership. In fact, what I'm saying is why you probably don't just want to do that, why you probably actually have multiple competing goals that you want to be aware of as you're thinking through this. I want to say a bit about respect for buses, because there are lots of attitudes out there in the society about buses. And to me, a bus is just any large capacity transit vehicle that runs on pavement rather than rails. And we should be open to it becoming whatever it wants to be and whatever we want it to be. We have the problem often in America that we end up with somewhat forlorn-looking infrastructure that starts to reinforce the message that buses are just for poor people or for people who are in some way unfortunate. And so I want to say that when I see this bus stop, even though this is in Los Angeles, even though this bus stop is not everything I would want it to be, and even though I think that curb lane should be a bus lane, I nevertheless recognize that first of all, these people are here because the bus is about to arrive. They all have apps. They've looked up the bus of their apps. They haven't actually stood there for hours. And they're here because the service is useful to them. They're here because the service is liberating to them in some way. And so I am always coming from a stance of respect or appreciation of them for using that service even before it is everything I might want it to be. One way to think of the people who are using transit now is that they are pioneers in the sense that, you know, just as it was necessary for a bunch of people to cross the Cascades in covered wagons so that we would someday have freeways and airplanes to cross the Cascades, we must value and respect the people who are using the service while it is not yet everything we want it to be. They are, in a sense, pioneering it for us. One of the things that I am particularly troubled by in a lot of the public transit discourse is that about 50 years ago now, actually, in the 1970s, someone with a computer model sat down to try to figure out how to model transportation behavior and came up with the idea. They were working, of course, it was the 1970s. They were working with very primitive computers, batch cards. And so they didn't have very much processing power. And so they made a simplifying assumption, which is that everybody who uses transit is either a choice rider, for which we are to visualize somebody who owns a car, has a car in their driveway, likes driving, and I'm somehow supposed to motivate them to not use their car. And on the other extreme, a dependent rider who we imagine, for whom we're to imagine somebody dressed for a factory job or a hotel job who presumably doesn't have the option of driving and who is therefore supposedly dependent. And when certain transportation planners get together and they think no one else is listening, they have an even worse word for these people. They call them captive riders. Captive riders like we have them in the dungeon. Now, the problem with that is that it doesn't actually describe human behavior. What actually happens is that if you allow transit to deteriorate below the point where it's providing useful access to those people who look dependent to you, those people will go away. This has happened repeatedly. It was happening a lot in the late teens. If you studied some of the ridership losses that big transit agencies were experiencing in the late teens, before the pandemic, a lot of the people who were disappearing from the transit system were the people that they would have described as dependent. In other words, they weren't that dependent after all. So it's real, and that has to do with the fact that driving was unusually cheap then. There were lots of people running around selling predatory car loans. There was a big effort to get people into cars, and the transit system was not effectively competing with that. So it goes to the importance of always being a remember that everybody is on a spectrum between extreme choiceness and extreme dependence. Everybody has some choices, everybody has some options, and that's why incremental little changes in service give us incremental payoffs, always. When I improve service a little bit, turn a frequency from 60 minutes to 30 minutes, I get a ridership payoff. If everyone were choice or captive, that wouldn't make sense, right? If everyone were choice or captive, then, well, the captives are already stuck with us, so what are you going to get from turning up a frequency? Well, it turns out we always do. So that's really fundamental, I think, to helping to open up our notions about who the transit rider is. You'll hear lots of presentations about specific transit riders. You'll have lots of conversations about specific transit riders, especially in the kind of market that you're working in here. There are few enough riders, you get to know them all, and that's great in its way. But you also have to not fall in love with your own image of what a transit rider looks like, because we grow ridership by letting people surprise us with who turns out to find transit useful. And if we make transit more useful, more people find it useful and use it, and they are not necessarily the people we're expecting. I want to say a quick word about flexible service, which you know here as dial-a-ride, the idea that there are both fixed routes and then there are also services that meander and respond to people's calls. Obviously, demand responsive service exists for people with disabilities, but there's also this growing space for demand responsive or on-demand services for the general public. So that is two different ways to serve the same kind of post-war suburban area that has lots of cul-de-sacs and difficult street patterns. And the one on the left is to say, nope, the bus is just going to follow a fixed route and you'll have to walk out to it and meet it at its stops on its fixed route. The other extreme, which is sort of extreme dial-a-ride, is to say, we have a vehicle that circulates in this area. It will drive to any address in this area on request and pick you up. It will take you anywhere in this area or to the hub, the connection point, which you see in the upper left-hand corner. And it may pick up other people along the way. But it mostly will be a taxi-like experience, except that it may stop and pick up other people along the way. So this image on the right is really popular. It's very, very easy to sell people this because it's just like a taxi, except it's cheaper. So our challenge is to recognize that although it's really, really appealing, it's also really, really inefficient. Because what we're doing in that door-to-door, fully flexible kind of on-demand mode is the vehicle is constantly meandering. It goes over here to get this person. It goes over there to get this person. It goes over there to get that person. It goes over here to drop off that person. You're not going to drive in a straight line. And which is one of the geniuses of fixed routes. The beauty of fixed routes is that people walk out and organize themselves in a straight line so that the bus can then follow a path that feels reasonably directed to the people using it. So those are kind of the extremes. But the challenge then is just the efficiency. If you think about what on-demand service has to do, and you ask, okay, we're going over here to get this person, we're going here to get this person, how many times can you expect to do that in an hour? 3, 4, 5? Way, way less than what you can get with fixed routes. Now, there are a bunch of intermediate kinds of flexibility, which I encourage you to think about as you're planning for your community. I particularly like this third one, which is that if your goal is the coverage of an area, then what you can do to make an on-demand service more efficient is to say, we're only going to go within a quarter mile of everyone, not to their door. I'm not talking about paratransit for the disabled here. I'm talking about general public service for able-bodied people. So you look up your app, and instead of saying it'll come to your door, it says I'll meet you at this corner within a quarter mile of your door. And now suddenly, you have to run there's about half of the street network that you no longer have to run on. You don't have to drive into cul-de-sacs. You don't have to drive down dirt roads and get stuck in people's driveways and all those things that happen when you're trying to go to people's doors. And so you get something that is quite a bit less inefficient, although it's still much less efficient than fixed routes. So those are your trade-offs. The other thing I want to emphasize too about fixed routes is that often we will hear that people will see a bus with mostly empty seats on it and they will assume that they're seeing waste. So please remember that a bus that is mostly empty is not necessarily waste as long as it is being useful to some people. Operating cost is mostly labor, which means the cost of running the bus is mostly the cost of the person driving the bus, which means the empty seats are relatively cheap. They're almost free. But it is much, much better to have too many seats than to have not enough. And so transit agencies are being smart by running the largest vehicle they will ever need. And that looks wasteful, but it isn't. And that's something we have to constantly be explaining to people. Now, some people are just coming at us with aesthetic reactions to the bus that they want to dress up as business considerations. And we just have to say, no, it doesn't make sense as a business consideration. If you want to have an aesthetic reaction to the bus, that's fine, but let's be clear that it's an aesthetic reaction. It's not inefficient in any way. So finally, I just want to say a little bit about location choice. As I mentioned in the beginning, everybody's decision about where to locate anything is a decision about how effective public transit will be. And in your community, as in most communities in America, decisions have been made over the last couple of generations, and some of them have been good for public transit, like the fact that downtown Hood River is a bustling, lively place, the fact that the Center for the Arts is right here on a downtown street corner instead of out on some cul-de-sac in an industrial park. That's great. But we all have, I want to encourage everyone to be aware of the geometric facts that make some places better for transit than others, because that's what makes transit planning politically hard, is that if you want ridership, we have to put the service here rather than there because this area is laid out to support it and that area isn't. And those people in that area think we disapprove of them in some way. And I have to say, no, we don't disapprove of your neighborhood. We are describing the consequences of its geometric layout. And that's what we have to keep coming back to. That's why I take pains to describe these things purely geometrically. So, land use drivers of ridership, there are 4: density, walkability, linearity, and compactness. Density, those 2 bus routes have the same cost to operate because they both have 2 buses on them. But in the upper image, there are twice as many people living within a quarter mile of every stop. So of course, all other things being equal, we're going to have more ridership where we have more density. In fact, we're going to have more than twice the ridership where we have more density, probably because people living at higher density often have other reasons to rely on cars less. Walkability. Those 2 circles have a dot in the center, which is a bus stop or transit stop, and the circle represents a quarter-mile radius around that stop. And the black lines inside the circle are the places on the street network where you can walk to the stop in a quarter mile. If you're in a connected street grid like we are here in downtown Hood River, the benefits of a bus stop radiate outward very efficiently and cover most of the area. If you're in a disconnected suburban-style street grid with lots of cul-de-sacs, those benefits are obstructed, reduced. It's exactly as though the density were lower as far as the viability for transit. Compactness, all of the things being equal, it is going to be cheaper for us to go shorter distances than longer distances, and we will tend to generate higher demand over somewhat shorter distances than longer distances, recognizing, of course, the special situation of extremely remote rural communities which just have to travel long distances to get to basic needs. And finally, linearity. This one's really fundamental. And this is the one, by the way, that I have to explain to all my architect friends because they understand density and walkability, but linearity I have to explain to them because it's specifically a transit problem. There are 2 different ways that the same community could be laid out. One of them, all 4 major destinations are in something that feels like a straight line. And as a result, one transit route will connect all of them and will feel like a reasonably fast path between any two of them. In the lower image, we have the office towers are on a cul-de-sac by the highway. Walmart is behind a quarter mile of parking. The college is up on a hilltop at the end of a squiggly road. And you have residential development in the cul-de-sac. Okay, you all know what this looks like. This means the bus has to drive further on a squigglier path, which will be less attractive to the people on the bus. Less use, it will provide less access at higher cost, and because the squigglier line is longer, it will cost more to operate, which means for the same amount of money, we won't be able to afford as much frequency. Everything about that lower geography is more difficult. Be aware when these decisions are being made. Notice the next time you have a conversation in your community about where a new, say, medical center or social service office or anything like that, and certainly if we're talking about a hospital or a college, pay attention to this and be thinking about how this is going to affect your transit problem. So, for example, all over the country, we have this standard community college kind of layout where the college has been, the buildings that people are actually going to have very intentionally been placed as far as possible from the straight arterials that transit could run on. So buses have to deviate back through the parking lot and get stuck. I had thought of showing you a screenshot of an example of this from the Dalles, but I'm sure you're familiar with that and I don't need to mention it. Social services. Pay attention to where social services are and kick up a fight when social services are making location decisions. Here's a horrific example from Salinas, California. And I pick on Salinas because it's the sort of place you'd expect to get this right. Average household income, $25,000. Overwhelmingly Spanish-speaking, overwhelmingly low-income city in on the coastal plain near Monterey. That's really the service center for the huge agricultural population there. And when we did the redesign of their bus network, we had to create this Route 96 just once an hour, wandering out past their municipal airport, which is just a rich people's business airport. There's no commercial service there. Why? Because the Monterey County Department of Child Support and the CalWorks Employment Services are in industrial buildings next to this private airport. And the county government center is at the end of a cul-de-sac on the other side of the freeway. And then there's the Social Security Administration. None of those things, all of those things could have been near the transit center, or they could at least have been in the walkable downtown if those organizations had cared about access from the diversity of people who actually have to get to them. Hartnell College, over there on the right, they had just chosen that location. They were just building that campus. And we were, and they were, of course, asking the transit agency for service, and I was giving the transit agency the tools to say, "Excuse me, why didn't we talk about this before you chose that location?" We have a bus going. We have that 4142 bus every 15 minutes, the busiest route in Salinas, going out Williams Street there. It's going out to a whole bunch more major destinations, huge amounts of dense low-income housing. Those people are in a hurry to get into town to get to everything. We asked ourselves, are we going to have to deviate all those buses just to go past that college because of where they put it? And we finally decided, no, the kids are going to have to walk. But it's frustrating because that's more than a quarter mile from the nearest transit, and those kids are, Hartnell College is the community college. It is the way that people grab onto the ladder of opportunity in a community like this. It's terrible that it's there, but it's not our fault that it's there. And next time, let's think about this when we decide where to locate something like that. So always ask, why is this thing here? Who decided to put it there? How do we not make that same mistake in the future? Thanks very much. Do I have time to take a couple questions?
Oh, yes.
Okay, great.
Let me get the mic for you. Walker. Yeah, raise your hand if you have any questions for Mr. Jarrett Walker. Don't be shy. He is pretty intimidating, I'm going to say. Yep. Megan Ramey.
I have a juicy one, but I don't know if you're going to answer this, and you don't have to. Somebody who's currently in power federally, you went toe-to-toe with them on the former Twitter, and I was wondering what sparked that conversation.
Okay, we're talking.
And you can admit who it is, but I didn't want to out
It
them.
is true that in 2017, I got about 10 seconds of Elon Musk's undivided attention. And frankly, I don't make a big deal of it because I don't want any more. It wasn't pleasant, but he had been quoted as saying, I mean, I could look up the exact quote, it's in my book, to the effect of, I think public transit is just terrible because, you know, there you are, you're mixed in with there's a whole bunch of random strangers, one of whom might be a serial killer. And so my chapter about this is called A Bunch of Random Strangers because, of course, the fact that public transit introduces us to a bunch of random strangers is mathematically inseparable from how it succeeds. And so I use that quotation to make clear that many of the tech overlords who are trying to sell us a new vision of transportation are trying to sell us a new vision of private transportation whose primary goal is to protect us from ever meeting a stranger. And we need to ask ourselves whether that is in fact the overriding goal of the transportation system, given how incredibly inefficient that is when we make that the goal. So I sent a tweet, something to the effect that Elon Musk's hatred of sharing space with strangers is a luxury or pathology that only the rich can afford, and letting him design cities is the essence of elite projection. What I mean by elite projection, that's a term I coined, you can Google it. It means the tendency of very fortunate people to refer to their own experience when deciding how the transportation system should work. You hear this all the time. You know, I'll be in, I sometimes do, as part of my job, have to have dinner with billionaires, and they'll inevitably talk as though they're ordinary people and talk about, you know, how they go about making a particular trip. And I'm the person who has to say, that's great, please remember, you're a billionaire. That makes you extremely weird, and that makes your personal tastes not a good guide to what's going to work for most people. Because you're an elite, that makes you a tiny minority. And so that's the point about elite projection. So he just responded, he said, you're an idiot, and that's sort of the sum total of our, some people refer to it as a debate, which I think is perhaps too strong a word for what it actually was. But anyway, that's what happened, and that was that interchange, and I certainly hope that he's not listening at the moment, because I don't really want his attention right now. Yes.
Here, coming over to you.
At the start of your speech, kind of thinking along the lines of technology, you mentioned a little bit how in your revised book you talk about like pushing back on technology hype, and I'm just curious if there's like any more you want to like elaborate on or expound on for us of like what exactly you mean, what you envision.
So a couple of things. I mean, we've had a lot of hype around on-demand transit. So one of the things that happened in the late teens was that a whole bunch of companies started selling the idea of on-demand transit. There's a bunch of people in their 20s as though they'd invented it, you know? Like Dorothy Parker, every new generation thinks it invented sex, so of course we always have 20-year-olds who think they invented dial-a-ride. On-demand transit is a very old idea. I was designing them, you know, when I was designing them 30 years ago. In the old days, you had to call up on the phone and ask, and you know, had to be way in advance. Now they're a lot more efficient. And responsive, but it's not a new idea, and they're still as inefficient as they always were, pretty much. They're still vastly less efficient than fixed routes. And so I've had to push back a lot on the hype because those companies have gone directly to politicians and just confused them to the point that we now have politicians who are sitting on boards coming at me saying, but you're just talking about fixed routes. Fixed routes are old-fashioned. I have to explain why fixed routes are not old-fashioned. So there's that. The larger thing that's going on with technology hype, and it goes back to Megan's question, is that a whole lot of venture capital really is trying to solve the problem of how to create something that we can call transit, and there's a win there. They want to call it transit because they know transit is virtuous. They know that word transit sounds warm and fuzzy to people, but they want to find a way to create something that they can call transit that will protect people from the presence of strangers. And so, and often also they've decided that the intermediate stop is a horrible thing that must be abolished. So whether you think about like Elon Musk's, which is being rolled out in Las Vegas of Teslas running around in tunnels, connecting stations directly, or the people who are trying to do this with gondolas or trying to do this with various other technologies, a lot of money is going into this idea of trying to create something that gets people out of traffic, but that still keeps them in a pod. And I interact with some of these people. They've come to me. They've pitched things to me. I feel like some of these things have interesting niche applications, but because they're pitching for investors, the pitch is inevitably, this is going to transform everything. And so we just have to push back against that. We have to get tired of that. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yes, sir. Oh, okay.
You talked earlier about you go for the biggest bus possible, the most number of seats. Is there a tension between that and the flexible routing that you talked about with the third slide, and also the fuel source? So if we have electrical buses and there's a gap between being able to fuel them, so there's less flexibility. Is there a tension there, or am I missing something?
I think the major tension is that when you're trying to do on-demand, you often need to, especially in hilly communities like some of these here, you often need to go into some streets that a large vehicle can't get into. And so it's normal to have a smaller vehicle, use quite a bit of a smaller vehicle for that purpose. I think the fueling issue, I'm not going to take a stand on the fueling issue. For internal combustion, fuel has never been such a dominant part of operating cost as to really change this calculation very much. What's going on now with various alternative fuels, I think it's honestly too soon to say, but I think mostly there's a recognition that these fuels are only going to become standardized if they also end up being, not so massively expensive as to shift that calculation. Mostly the case for the smaller vehicle is the need to get into smaller, squigglier roads. Yeah.
We have time for one more.
One way in the back over there.
One more. Here you go. I'm going to pass this back up to you. Thank you.
I kind of had a question about the nature of public transit and the relationship that you've kind of alluded to between public and private enterprise. Mm-hmm. I guess I'm trying to figure out the way to best articulate this question, but I guess I'm wondering if you feel as though the nature of private enterprise kind of makes it unlikely that we will create a public transit system using that tool, and that this is probably going to fall into the hands of government to best serve the population. I wonder if you could just kind of speak. It's not really phrased quite as a question, but I was wondering if you could speak more to that. There have been lots of efforts to privatize public transit in some way. It ends up being a government responsibility in part because it has multiple goals that are not easily translated into the bottom line of private enterprise. For example, and this has been tried in Britain. Britain is just coming to the end, the UK is just coming to the end of a vast experiment in trying to run public transit as a private business. Did not work very well because what private businesses do is cut services that aren't carrying enough people, but government has other interests associated with who those services are serving. That's why in the public context, I want to talk about the ridership coverage trade-off,
because there are reasons people support transit that are associated with ridership, like green benefits, but there are reasons people support transit that are associated with coverage, like leave no one behind, provide some kind of lifeline. Those are opposite goals. Private sector can't deal with that. Private sector needs a goal. Now, there's a role for the private sector in companies that you can hire to run your buses for you, but they're not, but in that model, which we do use in the United States, they're not taking the risk. Their customer is not the rider, their customer is the government. They're simply providing a service for the government. So there's that sort of role. But I think that the nature of the competing goals and the need to think through the competing goals is the primary reason why this has to be public, because it's the sort of conversation that we can only clearly have in the forum of government. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'll go ahead and grab that back. Thank you.